Welcome back, friends. Another busy weekend of tournaments with some pretty interesting results. For this week's fact, folks, we're going to take a look at Thousand Suns and Astra Militarum. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Before we get started, we'll do the old YouTube pleasantries. If you like the video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps push the video out there for more people to see. If you really like the video, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you get all my latest videos. And if you're looking for any other ways to help support the channel, you can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/warfriends. Link in the description below. Thanks, guys. Let's get to it. All right, first up is the player numbers for the previous weeks. For last week, we had 944 players, bringing the Dataslate total up to 10,254. Games played was 4,596, bringing the Dataslate total up to 54,122. We had 18 tournaments, bringing the Dataslate total up to 183. All right, first up is the win percentage by armies for the previous week. So just a quick reminder, Games Workshop acceptable rate is 45 to 55%. Anything within that range will be in green. Anything 5% above or below will be in orange. Anything above or below that will be in red. Coming in number one last week, we had Deathwatch at 61.5%, then we had Adeptus Mechanicus at 56.2%, Thousand Suns at 55.1%, World Eaters at 52.5%, and then Necrons at 52.3%. Then down at the bottom, we had Agents at 10%, Imperial Knights at 31.4%, Chaos Marines. Then down at the bottom, we had Agents at 10%, Imperial Knights at 31.4%, Chaos Space Marines at 42%, Death Guard at 43.3%, and then Sisters of Battle at 44%. So these arrows here, they show the changes for each army versus the previous weeks and get an idea of how each army is kind of moving up and down the charts week over week. So it's fun to see some different armies up at the top here, and Deathwatch made its first appearance near the top of the charts at 61.5% win rate. It had a really good week. They didn't have a ton of players, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but players who did show up did very well. AdMech continued their strong results with 56.2% win rate, and then Thousand Suns had one of their good weeks again at 55.1%. Down the bottom, Agents struggled. There was only a couple of Agents players. 10% win rate. Can't really take too much from that. Imperial Knights, first time being down this low. They have been struggling quite a bit, but this is really a really rough week. They didn't have almost any meaningful results and struggled a lot with a 31% win rate. Chaos Space Marines and Death Guard both did pretty poorly as well, down around the low 40s. Sisters just under that 45%, and same as Grey Knights, they're just sort of above at 45.1%. But other than that, every army kind of falls within that like 46 to 52% win rate range, so it's not too bad. This was one of the more weird weeks win percentage-wise. We had one that was over 60%, then we had one down in the 30s. But, you know, it is interesting to see how sort of armies adjust and sort of go up and down week over week. But the sort of true results of how things are doing are obviously going to be in our Dataslate win rates, which is about 10 weeks of data. So it's fun to look at these and see how each army's doing. But, you know, you can't take too much into it because, you know, it can get some pretty wild swings week over week. All right, next up is the army representation for the previous week. So if everyone played every army equally, they'd be about 3.6, 3.7%. So it gives you an idea of how many players are playing each army. Coming in number one last week, we had Space Marines at 7.9%, Aeldari at 7.6%, Tyranids at 5.5%, Ember Children at 4.9%, and Chaos Space Marines at 4.9%. And then down at the bottom, we had Agents at 0.2%, Deathwatch at 1.1%, Thousand Suns at 1.7%, Imperial Knights at 1.9%, and Black Templars at 2.3%. So Aeldari and Space Marines, they kind of ran away with it, almost 8% each, kind of numbers we haven't really seen since the previous data slate with Knights and Death Guard. Not surprising to see them up that high. Both are doing very well, winning a lot of tournaments. Having a high representation kind of goes hand in hand with winning a lot of tournaments. You're just going to have more players with more players in the pool, better chance to win, but they're also getting some very good results, and especially Space Marines, who have had so many different detachments come out this data slate, really helps pull some players in. One of the surprising ones up at the top, Emperor's Children, 4.9%. I don't think we've seen Emperor's Children that high since they released. I don't even know if they were that high when they did first release, so interesting to see that for some reason, a ton of Emperor's Children players came out this week, and they got some okay results, which is good to see. And then down at the bottom, not surprising to see Thousand Suns down below 2%. They are doing okay, like win percentage and XOX percentage wise, but I think people are just a little annoyed with the changes still and kind of abandoning the army a little bit there. And Knights, this is the first time we've seen Knights down. They're normally up at least around the meta average or even above, but after weeks of poor results, I think the Knights players are finally starting to sort of jump ship and give up a little bit, and that shows with a 1.9% of the representation there, the lowest we've seen them in a long, long time. Not surprising to see all the other armies down there in the orange, a lot of usual suspects, except for Chaos Demons, they're usually up around the average, so I guess if you're going to have some armies up at the top gain some players, you got to lose them somewhere, and Demons is one of those armies that lost a few players this week. Overall, this is one of the more swingy weeks we've seen. Really high numbers up at the top and a lot of armies down under the sort of average range there in the green. You can't take too much from it week over week, but still pretty interesting to see how the players are sort of adjusting week over week to how each army's doing. All right, next up is the combined stats for the previous week. So we're looking at Army win rates, XOX1 percentage, and representation. Quick reminder, XOX1 percentage is the percentage of players who went undefeated or only one loss at a tournament, so 5-0 or 4-1. It is not a perfect stat, but it's a good way to compare it to the win percentage to see how an army is doing. The higher the XOX1, the more likely to see those armies at the top tables with greater chance to win a tournament. All right, coming in number one last week, we had Deathwatch, and then we had Thousand Suns, Adeptus Mechanicus, Necrons, and then Astra Militarum. And then down at the bottom, we had Imperial Agents, Imperial Knights, Death Guard, Chaos Space Marines, and Grey Knights. So like I mentioned, Deathwatch had a really good week. 1.1% representation. It's a little bit low. Not a lot of players, but the players who did show up did very well. I think they only had like 8 or 9 players, but about half of them went undefeated or only one loss, and that led to a very high win percentage and a very high XOX1. And spoiler alert, they actually did pick up a tournament win, which is the first of the Dataslate, so not surprising to see with as good a results as they got. Thousand Suns and Adeptus Mechanicus, another one of those armies who have a little bit lower representation, 1.7 and 2.9%, but also got very good results, over 55% win rate and over 25% XOX1. And in the case of Thousand Suns, over 30% XOX1, so really good results there. Down at the bottom, Imperial Knights, 0% XOX1. Not surprising to see that. 1.9% representation and a 31% win rate. I think players are finally starting to sort of abandon the ship there on Imperial Knights, and the XOX1 kind of shows it. You can still kind of feel okay about it if you're getting a decent win percentage. Maybe you're not doing great, you're just kind of living mid-boards. But last week, Imperial Knights pretty much got their show run in every instance, and no one had any good results with them. And Death Guard was another one of those armies that it had a really rough week. Only 2.4% of the people had any meaningful results, and that's only 1 or 2 players, and the rest struggled as well, sitting there on 43% win rate. So tough week for those two armies, but a really tough week for Knights. One of the ones that's kind of interesting there, though, is Astra Militarum. 28% XOX1, almost 29%, and a perfectly average representation of 3.7%, but a win rate of only 45.5%. So that tells me despite almost 1/3 of the players doing very well, their win rate is very low. Everyone who has around the same XOX1 as them is sitting at least in the 50% win rates there. So that tells me that the Astra Militarum players that did well did very well, and everyone else playing the army kind of struggled because it dragged that win rate way down. So there is quite a gap there between the average Astra Militarum player and the sort of experienced veteran ones who know what they're doing. So if there is any Astra Militarum players out there, let me know sort of what you think the issue is. Where are sort of the general players kind of falling short, and then where are those experienced players, if you have any experience with that yourself, where are they kind of making up the difference and getting some good results? All right, next up, we have the win percentage for detachments for the previous week. So again, this is the top 26 detachments, and I did filter it by at least 1% representation. So this helps filter out some of those armies who might have had some sort of spiked data with some very low player counts. So coming in number 1 last week, we had Black Spear for Deathwatch. Not surprisingly, only have 1 detachment at 61.5%. Stormlance at 59.9%, Shadowmark at 58%, Star Shatter at 57.9%, and then Invasion Fleet at 56.3%. So like I said, Black Spear is the only detachment for Deathwatch, and they had a 61% win rate, so it makes sense that they would as well. Shadowmark continues their really good results, 58%. They've been near the top of the charts every week. Stormlance, mixed between a few different codexes, had really good results as well. Somber Shogun with Coterie the Conceited had a good week at a 50% win rate and 4% representation. So 4% of the entire player base was playing Coterie. They got almost a 51% win rate out of it, so they're doing very well. Other than that, it's the same usual suspects we kind of see week over week, kind of moving up and down the charts depending on how each one's doing. The only one that's kind of a surprise this week was Coterie doing as well as it did, and Black Spear doing very well, but again, that just goes hand in hand with how Deathwatch is doing. Overall, though, chart is fairly balanced. There's really no detachment kind of running away with things. Shadowmark and Star Shatter are doing very well, usually week over week, 58% and for both of them. But as far as one specific detachment having a really high win rate, that's not too bad to see those two up that high near the top of the charts. So overall, everything's looking pretty balanced. All right, next up is the tournament wins for each army last week. So coming in number 1, we had Space Marines with 3, Necrons with 3, then we had Deathwatch with 2, and Chaos Knights with 2. So this was Deathwatch's first win of the Dataslate, and they got 2 this week, so that's really great to see. Then we had Tyranids, Sisters, Orcs, Leagues of Votan, Death Guard, Dark Angels, Chaos Space Marines, and Astra Militarum all with 1. So like I said, Space Marines continue to keep winning, and not surprising to see they have a good win percentage, good XOX1, and lots of players, so 3 wins for them. Deathwatch finally picked up a win for this Dataslate, and they picked up 2, which is great to see. And despite Death Guard's really poor results, they managed to pull it a win. So out of the 2.4% of the players who went undefeated, only one loss. One actually managed to win a tournament. And now we're moving on to the tournament wins for each sub-faction. This kind of breaks down how each army is getting their wins. So Gladius picked up 2. Blackspear picked up 2, obviously for Deathwatch. Awakened Dynasty for Necrons picked up 2. For Death Guard, it was Taliban Summoners, so it's one of the ones you don't see too often picking one up. Obviously, for Space Marines, Shadowmark's got to win one, because they always do. And one of the ones that you don't see as well very often is the Iconoclast Fiefdom for Chaos Knights. They picked up a win there. All right, moving right along, we're on to the win percentage by armies for the current data slate. So this is the last 10 weeks of data here. So coming in number 1, we have AdMech at 55.6%, Sisters of Battle at 54.1, Aeldari at 52.5, Deathwatch at 51.6, and Genestealers at 51.6. And down at the bottom, we have Agents at 38.9, Imperial Knights at 44.4, Emperor Children at 45.5, and then Drukhari at 46.5, and Astra Miliatarum at 46.8. So AdMech remains in the top spot with 55.6% win rate. They had a good week and it kind of bumped it up a little bit, but still just barely over that threshold. Sisters and Aeldari kind of maintain their spots roughly where they were. Deathwatch creeps up into like a tie for 4th place there with a good week they had. And then down to bottom, Agents 38.9%, roughly where they've been. Imperial Knights with their really bad week dropped down a little bit further, just under the 45% win rate. So despite their poor results, they're still just kind of teetering around that 45, which is still not a very good place to be. Emperor's Children had a good week, so they bumped them up to 45.5. So they're the only ones who are kind of in danger of falling below that range. But another good week or two, and they'll be pretty clear of that 45% range there. And other than that, from Drukhari up to, say, Demons at 50%, you have the majority of the army sitting between like 50 and 47%, which is great to see. Chart is looking very balanced, and there's a couple armies above and below the threshold there, but they're just above and below. I would expect AdMech to get a few tweaks, and I would expect Imperial Knights to get a few tweaks, and maybe Emperor's Children and stuff like that. But overall, very balanced data slate so far. All right, moving on is the army representation for the current data slate. So again, this is the percentage of players who play each army. If everyone played everything equally, they'd be about 3.6, 3.7%. Coming in number 1, we have Space Marines at 7.3%, World Leaders at 6.2, Aeldari at 5.9, Death Guard at 5.5, and then Necrons at 4.5. And at the bottom, we have Agents at 0.3, Deathwatch at 0.9, Genestealer Cults at 1.6, and Thousand Suns at 2%. So as the data slate kind of rolls on and it's kind of coming to a close, I expect a balanced data slate to come out in the next maybe 3 weeks or so. I think last year was right around Christmas time, so they might let this kind of play out for a little bit longer than usual, but probably around the like 13 to 14 week mark, we're going to see a new one drop there. Everything's looking pretty good. I have a couple of outliers at the top. Space Marines obviously are going to be up at the top. They're doing really well, winning a lot of tournaments, and they're popular anyways. World Leaders and Aeldari continue to be up there. Down at the bottom, usual suspects, Genestealers, Deathwatch, Thousand Suns, Drukhari, Grey Knights. And other than that, everything's looking pretty good. There's only a few armies down in the orange, and Genestealer Cults and Deathwatch are usually down below the sort of orange threshold into the red there. Just they're not very popular armies. And as far as representation for a data slate goes, it's not too bad. You're always going to have a few outliers here and there, but overall, looking pretty good. All right, next up is the combined stats for the data slates. We have Army win rates, XOX1 percentage, and representation. Just a quick reminder again, XOX1 percentage of players who went undefeated or only one loss at a tournament, so 5-0 or 4-1. Compare it with the win rate to kind of get an idea of how our army is doing. The higher the XOX1, the more likely you're going to see those armies at the top tables. So coming in number 1 for the data slate so far, we have Aeldari. Then we have Sisters of Battle, AdMech, Tau, and Space Marines. And down at the bottom, we have Agents, Imperial Knights, Emperor's Children, Astra Miliatarum, and Drukhari. Again, like a lot of the other data slate charts, this one is fairly balanced. We have a few outliers at the top. Aeldari's kind of in first place because of the representation. If the representation was closer to Sisters and AdMech, they'd all be about the same. And then down at the bottom, you have just a few armies who are kind of struggling there. Imperial Agents always are kind of down that low just due to representation. And usually they kind of struggle to get some meaningful results. And then Imperial Knights is the one army who's doing very poorly. They're the only one that's below 10% XOX1 for the entire data slate, and they're at about 7.7%, so that's really low. The representation is about bang on the average, but if they have a couple more weeks like this week, it could see it drop quite a bit. But they're the only ones who are in like desperate need of some help. Everyone else is a little bit below the average. The average XOX1 is about 15%, 14 to 15%. So we have a few around 19, but the fact that we don't have anything into the 20s for this entire data slate is actually really good to see, considering last data slate we had Death Guard and Imperial Knights both sitting well over 20%. So very balanced. getting good results with a few armies doing a little bit better than others, but for the most part, everyone's landing right in that sweet spot in the middle. And so there's obviously a few armies at the top and the bottom. It could use a few tweaks, but overall, this Dataslate has been very balanced, and it's great to see. Next up is the detachment results for the current Dataslate. Again, this is the top 26 detachments with a minimum 1% representation, just to weed out any of the detachments who might get some weird results with such a low player count. So coming in number 1 for the Dataslate, we have Shadowmark at 58%, Aspect Host at 56.2%, Star Shatter at 55%, Hail's Creed at 54.4%, and Howled Martyrs at 54.3%. Shadowmark and Aspect Host still remain at the top. Star Shatter and Hail's Creed and Hallowed Martyrs are all, one of those ones who just keep doing consistently well as well, and they've been sort of the top 5 this entire data slate. Coterie did manage to squeak in there, 47.5%, so they had a good week, and just enough to sort of bring them onto the bottom of the chart there. Hopefully they can get a few more wins and kind of prop themselves up a little bit. But for the most part, there's a lot of the same detachments. They might shift up and down week over week depending on how they did. But this is kind of what we've been seeing for the last few weeks. But overall, it's really good. Most of the detachments are anywhere from like 48 to like 55%. And for the fact that our highest detachment win rate for the entire data slate is only 58%, is really great to see. We don't have any one detachment sort of running away and dominating everything like we kind of seen sometimes with Orcs when they had Tactical Brigade for that little bit, or Mordaka and stuff like that, like when those one specific detachments are a problem. Shadowmark is doing very well, and I would expect to see them get a few tweaks here and there, but overall, everything's looking pretty balanced. All right, moving on, we're on to tournament wins for the current data slate, and this is broken down week over week, so each week is represented by a different color, so you get an idea of how and when sort of each army is getting their wins. So coming in number 1, we have Aeldari at 19, Space Marines at 17, Tau at 12, and then we had Necrons and Sisters at 11, and Astra Miliatarum at 10. So Agents is the only army left with a tournament win. Don't have high hopes for that, but Deathwatch did get 2 wins this week, so that's great to see. So now we're just sitting with a couple armies down with 1, but everything else has got at least 2. And for the fact that the top armies, Aeldari and Space Marines, I mean, that kind of lines up with the representation and XOX1 and everything like that. They're still not kind of running away with it. Really like a little bit above 3rd and 4th place there. So most of the armies are living anywhere from that like 5 to 11 range, and that's really good to see. Interesting spread of armies up at the top there. AdMech managed to pull out 9. That's the most they've seen in a long time from them. Even Votann has 6. They don't win a ton of tournaments either. Tau is up at 12, which is great to see. So, interesting spread and lots of spread across all kinds of different armies, and it is really nice to see after what we kind of went through last data slate. All right, moving on to the first faction focus this week, and we're going to take a look at Thousand Sons. So looking at the previous 8-week results here, we can see that their army representation is anywhere from like 1.5 to like 2.5%, but kind of living around the 2% mark. Their army win percentage is kind of swingy, anywhere from 45 to just over 55%. So depending on the week, they're kind of up and down. Despite their good results for the most part, like, if you balance everything out, it's right around the average. I think people are still a little annoyed with the changes that were made, and that's why you're not seeing too many players. You would expect to see more players for Thousand Sons based on the results they're getting. But if you take a look at their stats versus the meta average, you can see the win rate is pretty much bang on. Just above 49.7 versus 49. Army representation is quite low at 2% versus 3.6. XOX1 is 13.9 versus 14.6, so pretty much the average there. But they are struggling to get any tournament wins with only 2 versus the average of about 6.8. Looking at the sub-faction player counts there, you can see Grand Coven makes up almost 60% of the player base. And then you have the Rubicon Phalanx at 28%, and then everything else is down under 10%. Taking a look at the sub-faction win percentage there, you can see Grand Coven, despite their large player counts, they're one of the detachments who is actually kind of doing the worst. But it's still only about a 48% win rate, so that's really not that bad. Rubicon Phalanx is doing very well at almost 53% win rate, so we could start to see some more players using that detachment moving forward if the results continue with that. And everything else has got such a low player count, you can't take too much out of it. And they only have 2 tournament wins, but it is split between Rubicon and Grand Coven. So like I said, overall, they're doing okay. They're kind of lacking in tournament wins, so they don't really have that like finishing power. And that could just be because a lot of the faction experts and the sort of experienced Thousand Sons players aren't playing them right now because they got a little annoyed, or they didn't like the changes, or they just don't like the way the army plays anymore. So they've kind of moved on to other things. The average player is getting some decent results. Average with the meta, which is what you want to be. So if there's any Thousand Sons players out there, let me know what you think will be changed, what you're hoping to be changed in the next data slate to kind of bring some players back and sort of breathe some life back into the faction, because it kind of got gutted there in the last data slate. All right, next faction focus is Astra Militarum. So they can look at the previous 8-week results. We can see their army representation is pretty consistently from about 3.5 to 4.5%, and their win rate is pretty consistently anywhere from like 45 to 50%, but generally speaking, living around the 46% win rate mark there. Good representation. Astra Militarum is always one of those well-represented armies, but kind of a poor win percentage, and I think if they had a bit higher win percentage, you'd see a lot more players. They're usually sitting over 4% pretty healthily most data slates, but when they're getting this poor results as a whole, you're going to see less players, so that's kind of what's playing out there. Looking at the stats versus the meta average, you can see their win rate is below the meta average at a 46.8 versus 49. Their army representation is slightly above, 3.9 versus 3.6. XOX1 is 12 versus 14.6, so that's another one of those results that's kind of struggling a little bit. Not too bad, but they do have 10 tournament wins versus the average is 6.8, so players who know what they're doing are still managing to pull out some wins there. Looking at the subfaction player counts, you can see Combined Arms makes up almost 60% of the players, and then you have Hammer of the Emperor with about 24%, and then everyone else is sitting under about 7% representation. And then taking a look at the bottom with the subfaction win percentage there, you can see Combined Arms is about a 48% win rate, so it is one of the better detachments. And Hammer of the Emperor, the one with the next highest representation, is only at a 43.6%. So they're kind of struggling there, and it's kind of bringing the win percentage down a little bit. All the other ones you have to take with a grain of salt because there's just not a ton of players, so you can't look too much into that. And looking at the tournament wins, Combined Arms picked up 6, Hammer of the Emperor 2, Recon Element 1, and Bridgehead picked up 1 as well. So a little bit of a spread there across the detachments. They're always going to be one of those armies who have a lot of players, so the representation is going to be a little bit masked by the fact that they're a popular army, but they're definitely struggling to get some results. I do think there's some like faction experts and some diehards who will be able to get results with pretty much anything with Guard, and they're still pulling out some tournament wins with 10, so getting lots of those. But as a whole, I think the player base is struggling to get some good results here. Any Guard players out there, let me know sort of what you guys think of the current army. How is it playing in the meta? So let me know where you're kind of falling short and kind of what's working, what is picking up those wins, like what's kind of differentiating those players who are able to get the wins versus the majority of the players who are kind of struggling. Feels like a faction that, because of the popularity, because of the the Guard or the Everyman, lots of players play them. Not everyone might play them optimized or the specific way you need to play them to win when they are struggling. I'm sure there is a couple things within the codex that do very well, and if you kind of lean into those, you will get some good results. But as a whole, they're not pulling out the best results right now. So hopefully some few changes can be made here and there, and they can kind of bring up some of those numbers a little bit and get them into a little bit better of a spot. All right, and that's it, guys. Thanks for watching this week. Huge shout out to my Patreon members, Meet the Great, John Gurman, Oscar the Vile, Stayak, Eric Johnson, Rob BL, and our newest one, Ivatal. If you guys want to join these fine folks, you can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/warfriends, link in the description below. Good luck in the tournaments coming up this weekend, guys, and I will see you next week.